The restaurant glowed with polished marble, soft jazz, and the quiet confidence of people who never checked prices. Crystal glasses caught the light like trophies. Conversations floated about investments, vacations, power. In the center of it, all sat the billionaire, relaxed, amused, untouched by the cost of anything on the table. He wiped his mouth, glanced at the receipt, and smiled the way men smile when the world has never told them no. He signed the bill slowly. Then he stood, slipped on his coat, and placed a single folded bill on the table. $10, not a mistake, not forgotten, deliberate. Nearby diners noticed. A couple exchanged looks. A man scoffed into his wine. Someone whispered his name, disbelief curling into judgment. This was a man known for excess, for throwing money like confetti, for headlines that included words like billionaire and tycoon and mogul. And yet, here it was. $10, left like a verdict. The waitress approached, shoulders heavy from a double shift, feet aching, smile practiced thin. She picked up the check without thinking, already bracing herself. When she saw the tip, she stopped. Her eyes stayed on the number longer than politeness required. For a moment, the room expected the usual script, a forced smile, a quiet swallow, gratitude wrapped around humiliation. That was how this story normally went. That was how power liked it. Instead, she looked up. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It cut clean through the noise. She said, calm enough to be dangerous, I hope you don't think this is generosity. The billionaire paused. Chairs stilled. Forks hovered mid-air. Even the music seemed to hold its breath. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She met his eyes like an equal, not an employee. I serve people like you every night, she continued, steady and clear. Not because I'm invisible, because this work feeds my family. But don't confuse my labor with permission to measure my worth. A murmur rippled through the room. Phones tilted. Attention shifted. This wasn't anger. This was something sharper. The billionaire turned fully now, studying her as if she'd spoken a language he'd forgotten existed. The smirk faded. In its place came something unfamiliar, something unsettled. She placed the bill gently back on the table. Keep it, she said. If that's what respect looks like to you, I won't take it. Silence fell, heavy and complete. No one laughed. No one moved. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Around them, the restaurant felt smaller, tighter, as if wealth itself had leaned in to listen. Every face carried the same question. Would power retreat, or would it answer back? Years of hierarchy trembled on that single, unguarded exchange. The billionaire didn't walk away. Not yet. The room waited, breath held tight, because in that moment, her words struck something buried beneath decades of money and insulation. Something no one had challenged in years, and he realized this wasn't a test anymore. It was a mirror. And he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. He learned to test early, long before the money became a war between him and people. Back when ambition still felt like hunger, he watched smiles change in the moment wealth entered the room. Praise grew louder. Truth grew quieter. By the time billions followed his name, sincerity felt extinct, replaced by rehearsed gratitude and eyes trained on exits and envelopes. So he invented a ritual. A small one, cruel maybe, but efficient. He would tip low, deliberately, and watch what emerged. In Chicago, a waiter cursed him under his breath. In Miami, a hostess laughed nervously and chased him with forced sweetness. In New York, a server thanked him like a penitent and vanished. Different cities, same conclusion. Everyone wanted something. No one meant what they said. No one meant what they said. Each reaction hardened him. Each confirmed a story he told himself at night, alone in penthouses that echoed too loudly. That money stripped people of dignity, or perhaps revealed the lack of it. He preferred the lie where he was the observer, not the cause. It made the loneliness feel earned instead of tragic. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Another polished room, another face trained to please, another quiet verdict delivered with a folded bill. He expected resentment or desperation, maybe. A performance designed to claw back what he withheld. He was already halfway out of the moment before it even finished. But then she spoke. No trembling gratitude. No anger sharpened into accusation. Just truth, unadorned and unafraid. Her words didn't beg him to be better. They assumed he could be. That was new. That was dangerous. She wasn't selling morality. She wasn't demanding justice. She was naming reality. And in doing so, she took away the armor he'd built from assumptions. He felt exposed in a way no headline or protest had ever managed. This wasn't a crowd shouting. This was one voice refusing to play her part. He told himself she was an outlier, an anomaly. Statistics always allowed for exceptions. But the calm, in her eyes, unsettled him. It wasn't courage fueled by nothing to lose. It was dignity that didn't ask permission. He realized with a jolt that his test had failed, not because she reacted poorly, but because she hadn't reacted at all. The room waited for him to respond, to reassert the hierarchy everyone understood. Money speaks, labor listens. That was the unspoken rule. Yet her silence after those words felt heavier than any insult. It demanded a choice. For years, he had walked away from tables like this, satisfied that humanity had proven him right. Tonight, his feet felt heavier. The exit sign glowed, familiar and comforting, offering retreat. He took a step, then another. The old script tugging at him. He felt eyes on his back. Not hungry ones, but questioning, measuring him the way he measured others. For once, status offered no shelter. The power he carried suddenly required explanation. He remembered his father's hands, rough from work, teaching him that dignity was not something you bought, but something you guarded. Somewhere along the climb, he had traded that lesson for efficiency and called it wisdom. Now it rang hollow. The test had always been simple because it was rigged. He controlled the terms, the money, the exit. She had removed the exit. By refusing the script, she forced him to confront the quiet violence of his assumptions. Around them, privilege waited to see if it would be defunded. He inhaled, aware that whatever he did next would be watched, shared, judged. The door was still there, faithful as ever. So was the table. Between them stretched a choice he had avoided for years, one that threatened the comfort of his certainty and the myth of his superiority. It pressed on him heavy and undeniable, promising that retreat would preserve his image, but return might shatter it forever. Now he paused, halfway to the door. For the first time in years, he turned around. She didn't plan to speak. She planned to work, to finish the shift, to pick up her daughter before the sitter charged another hour they couldn't afford. Her life ran on minutes and margins, on alarms set before sunrise and exhaustion swallowed after midnight. Double shifts were not ambition. They were survival. She carried plates the way others carried resumes, each step a calculation, each smile a shield. When he turned back, she felt the room lean toward her, but she didn't shrink. She had learned long ago that shrinking costs more than standing still. She told him she was a mother before she was a waitress, that every tip decided groceries, or gas, notebooks, or bus fare. She said it plainly, without tremor, without tears. Pity was expanded. It demanded gratitude. She refused to buy it. It's not about how much you give, she said, voice steady as a held line. It's about what you think I'm worth. The words landed hard. They didn't accuse him of cruelty. They accused the system that trained him to confuse generosity with dominance. She spoke of invisible mornings, of floors mopped after applause ended, of hands that made luxury possible and were never invited to enjoy it. Her labor, she said, wasn't charity work. It was work. And work deserved dignity, not tests. Around them, customers stopped pretending not to listen. A server paused with a tray. A bartender leaned in. Phones rose like periscopes. The room filled with a quiet electricity, the kind that precedes a storm. She wasn't ranting. She was explaining, patient and precise, translating a life most people preferred to keep abstract, she told him. She taught her daughter to say please and thank you, but also to ask why. She said gratitude without respect was a leash, and she wouldn't pass that down. She named the war no one called a war, where comfort depended on someone else's ache, where wealth floated because work sank. Not villains and heroes, she said. Just choices repeated until they felt natural. He tried to interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She waited. Silence obeyed her. When she continued, it was with an invitation, not a challenge. Look at me, she said. Not the apron, not the role. Me, she told him. She wasn't angry. Anger burned out too fast. She was tired of being measured by generosity that came with strings. The room hummed. A laugh escaped somewhere. Nervous, quickly swallowed. A woman nodded. A man frowned. Online. The first clip went live. Captions forming before conclusions. Comment counters ticked upward like heartbeats. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a lesson unfolding in real time. She spoke of pride, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that keeps you standing when bending would be easier. She said immigrants taught her that work was a language, and dignity its grammar. She said the country ran on people who showed up unseen, and that seeing them wouldn't bankrupt anyone. It would just change the math. Faces shifted as the meaning spread. A regular removed his watch and set it down as if time itself needed to listen. Another patron wiped their eyes, embarrassed by the recognition. The staff clustered closer, no longer afraid. This was their story too, carried in backs and wrists and knees. The power of it moved outward, jumping screens, reaching kitchens and buses and break rooms, where comments multiplied, stitched together by the same sentence repeated with all dot. In the glare of attention, she remained anchored. She did not claim to speak for everyone, only to speak honestly from where she stood. That restraint made the message heavier. It left space for others to step in, to add their own stories, to feel less alone. The crowd understood this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning disguised as a boundary, a hush, settled, reverent, and fragile. It felt like the seconds after a truth lands, when denial searches for footing and finds none. The balance of the room tipped subtly but decisively. Even the air seemed to wait for permission, or acknowledgement, or response from him. Right now, in silence together, watching closely, hearts racing. He watched her, stunned by the absence of performance. No plea, no curse, just truth, clean and unyielding. He felt the room side with her, not out of spite, but recognition. He realized he had mistaken silence for consent, survival for satisfaction. When she finished, she exhaled, not relieved, but resolved she had said what needed saying whether it cost her or not. The pause afterwards stretched thick with consequence. Notifications chimed, screens glowed, a story found its spine, and just like that, the billionaire sat down, nodded his table a bit at hers, in silence. The clip didn't crawl online, it detonated. By morning, millions had watched her words slice through the illusion of civility, had replayed his stunned silence, had argued about dignity in comment sections that never slept. Morning shows debated it like a trial. Night shows treated it like a confession. The billionaire's name trended beside words he couldn't control, and for the first time, money failed to buy silence. Then, just as quickly, he vanished. No interviews, no statements, no damage control. The absence spoke louder than any apology could. Weeks passed. The outrage matured into expectation, then curiosity. Reporters waited outside gates that never opened. Friends claimed ignorance. Family sources whispered about tension, about calls unanswered, about boardrooms where his chair sat empty. He returned to a house he barely remembered and listened to the echo of his own steps. In the quiet, he replayed a voice, not accusing, not pleading, simply insisting on worth. It unsettled him more than anger ever had. He began reading letters. He'd ignored histories he'd avoided, remembering hands at built before they begged. The announcement landed without spectacle. A legal filing, a headline, a pause. He had rewritten his will, not adjusted, not diversified. Rewritten 90% of his fortune redirected into a foundation bearing a name. Scholarships for first-generation students. Housing for workers priced out of the cities they served. Healthcare grants for families one emergency away from collapse. The markets blinked. Analysts stuttered. This wasn't philanthropy as image. Repair, it was structural, deliberate, irreversible. A transfer of power disguised as generosity. The backlash came swift and furious. Relatives called it betrayal, an inheritance stolen by a moment of weakness. Advisors warned of instability, of precedent, of reputational risk. Corporate friends reminded him how things were done, how wealth stayed within bloodlines and boards. He listened, then declined. When pressed, he answered simply, "She reminded me who I was before money made me forget." There was no flourish in it, no absolution sought, just a line drawn where convenience used to live. News cycles gorged themselves. Some praised courage, others mocked performative guilt. Lawsuits threatened, stock prices wobbled. Through it all, he stayed quiet, refusing with the stage he once owned. He met with organizers instead of lobbyists, with nurses instead of bankers. He learned how systems punished work and rewarded distance. Each meeting confirmed what her words had cracked open. Wealth was loud, dignity was quiet. He chose the quiet, knowing it would cost him everything he'd been taught to protect. She learned about the will from her phone, vibrating through another shift. A co-worker showed her the headline, eyes wide with disbelief. She felt the room tilt again, the old fear rising. This was never the point. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She hadn't wanted a crown. She wanted respect to stop being conditional. The foundation bore her name, but not her permission. That unsettled her more than the money ever could. He requested a meeting. No cameras, no press. She hesitated, then agreed. He thanked her without asking forgiveness. He told her he didn't need her approval to do what felt necessary. She told him change without accountability curdled fast. They spoke of safeguards, of governance, of voices that needed seats at tables. It wasn't mentorship, it was negotiation, grounded and wary, each refusing to surrender agency as details emerged. Applications flooded in. Stories poured out. The foundation became a conduit for truths long ignored, a ledger of needs finally read aloud. Politicians scrambled to attach themselves. Workers saw possibility where there had been only endurance. Critics warned of dependency. Supporters spoke of repair. The conversation shifted from one man's decision to a collective reckoning about who prosperity was for and who had left behind. Public hearings followed. Panels convened. Op-eds argued whether conscience could be legislated or only modeled. In kitchens and classrooms, people debated what dignity required and who decided its price. Workers saw leverage in visibility. Executives saw risk in precedent. The foundation announced advisory seats reserved for service workers, immigrants, caregivers, and patients, not as mascots but as governors. That choice inflamed critics and electrified supporters. It suggested a future where those who bore the cost of comfort also shaped its rules. Donations surged, not from billionaires seeking absolution, but from millions giving small amounts with fierce intent, determined to turn a moment into a movement that outlived personalities and headlines. Meanwhile, lawsuits stalled and faded as public pressure hardened. Universities rewrote aid criteria. Cities piloted housing tied to wages. None of it was perfect. All of it was motion. The billionaire watched from the margins, learning to be irrelevant to the outcome, accepting that repair meant relinquishing authorship. She watched too, wary of myths forming around her name, insisting on transparency, insisting on work, insisting the story remain unfinished so others could enter it without permission. Momentum built unevenly, loudly, irresistibly, like a tide discovering new paths through old stone. Change argued back against gravity itself. Behind the scenes, threats arrived alongside praise, forcing security plans and sleepless nights, testing resolve, testing trust, testing whether courage could survive consequence. She felt fear. Then, we chose steadiness, anchoring herself in purpose while the world rearranged expectations around her. History pressed close, waiting. Every choice now carried echoes. Nothing felt small anymore, ever, but even she didn't expect what would happen next. Months later, she stood beneath lights bright enough to wash the color from everything except truth. The stage was grand, the invitation formal, the audience national. They expected polish, a symbol sharpened for applause. What they received was a woman who spoke the way she always had, grounded, unvarnished, steady. She told them she wasn't famous, she was visible, and there was a difference. She spoke about work as identity, not punishment, about hands that built mornings and closed nights, about parents who stitched futures together between shifts. She said dignity was not an abstract value but a daily practice, measured in how people were addressed, believed, and paid. Her voice carried no bitterness. It carried clarity. The room listened, not because she demanded it, but because recognition had weight. The clip traveled again, but differently this time. Less outrage, more resolve. Boards announced donations. Foundations rebranded missions. Some called it a wave of generosity. Others called it pressure. She called it overdue attention. Money moved, yes, but so did language. Service workers became neighbors. Immigrants became contributors. Work became visible again. That mattered more than the numbers. She reminded them she didn't need saving. We need seeing, she said, letting the sentence breathe. Seeing meant names remembered, hours respected, wages aligned with reality. Seeing meant understanding that gratitude without justice was theater. The applause rose, sustained and complicated. She accepted it without bowing, without shrinking. Afterward, she declined the circuit. She returned to routine, to alarms and backpacks and schedules. Cameras faded, headlines shifted. The work continued. At the diner, the bell chimed. Coffee poured, plates moved. Laughter found its way back in, the kind that lives between people who know each other's names. She wore the apron again, not as a symbol, but as herself. A man left $10 on the table. She noticed, then smiled. Not because it was enough, because she was big. She picked up the bill and met his eyes. Not to instruct, not to perform, just to acknowledge. He nodded, embarrassed, thoughtful, human. That was new to across the country. Small changes stacked. A manager adjusted schedules. A customer learned a name. A policy shifted a line item. None of it made the news. All of it mattered. The billionaires stayed mostly quiet, funding systems instead of stories, comfortable in the background, accountable to structures that didn't need his voice to function. He had learned that the point was not redemption. It was redistribution of attention. At home, she helped with homework, cooked dinner, listened to a child describe a day that felt possible. The future remained uncertain. Bills still arrived. Work still ached, but the ground beneath her felt firmer. She had seen what happened when truth refused to whisper. People argued about what it meant. They always would. But something had shifted in the way a nation looked at the hands that held it together. Less as props, more as people. That was the win she wanted. Not a pedestal, a standard. She wiped a counter, tied her apron, and laughed with a co-worker. Outside, the day moved on, imperfect and alive. Inside, dignity had found a place to sit. And in a world obsessed with wealth, sometimes the richest person in the room is the one carrying a tray.